Welcome to Late Night Calm. Tonight we are going to climb a ladder together very slowly, one gentle rung at a time, from the bottom of a vanished America all the way to its glittering top. This is the world they later called the Gilded Age, and by the time you drift off somewhere along the way, you will have felt what it was to stand on each of its steps. There is nothing to solve here, nothing to remember, nothing to hold on to. There is only the climb, and my voice, and the slow, warm distance we will cover between now and sleep. So before we begin, let yourself settle. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. And let your jaw go soft. And let your breathing find its own slow rhythm without you having to push it. If these quiet journeys bring you a little calm, you might like this video, or subscribe, or leave a soft thought in the comments below. Only if it feels easy. It helps others who lie awake find their way to a place like this too, one peaceful night, one sleepy soul at a time. But that can wait. For now there is only you, and the dark, and the story. Let's begin. Imagine then that you are lying in a bed that is not quite yours, in a building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near the very end of the 1800s. The night is not fully dark, and it is not fully quiet, because in this part of the city true dark and true quiet are luxuries that belong to other people. There is a sound you would come to know so well you'd stop hearing it, and yet it is always there. It is the sound of the air shaft. Somewhere close to your head, running straight up through the middle of the building, there is a narrow slot of open space, only a couple of feet wide. A gap between your wall and the wall of the building next door. The men who designed this building called it an air shaft, and they meant it kindly. They meant for a little light to fall down into the middle of the block, and for a little fresh air to reach the inner rooms that would otherwise have no window at all. But that is not what the shaft became. What it became was a tall, dim, foul-smelling chimney of other people's lives. Garbage fell down it, tossed from windows above yours, because where else was garbage to go? The smells of 100 suppers and 100 stove fires drifted up it. Voices came up it too, arguments and lullabies and coughing, so that all night the private sounds of strangers pressed themselves gently against your ear through that 2-foot gap of stale air. And if a fire ever started at the bottom, the shaft would pull the flames straight up like a flue in a stove. You would learn to sleep beside it anyway, because a body will learn to sleep beside almost anything when it is tired enough, and you are tired. You are tired because of what the day costs and what the day pays. For a full day of unskilled labor, the kind of work a newly arrived immigrant could actually get, the wage was somewhere around $1.25. Perhaps $1.50 if the work was a little harder or a little more dangerous. $1.25. By nightfall, you might have $5 worth of today's money in your pocket when you translate it across all the years. But let the period figure sit first, because the period figure is the one you'd feel in your hand. $1.25 for the whole long day. Over a good year, if the work never stopped, that might come to $400, maybe $500. But the work did stop. It stopped when the weather turned, when the season ended, when a machine broke, when the man above you simply had no more use for you that week. So you never quite counted on the full year. You counted on today, and on the $1.25, and on making it stretch. Now, let that wage settle into your body for a moment, because it is the floor of everything we are about to climb. Everything else in this story, every marble hallway, and every private railroad car, and every jeweled costume, we will eventually reach at the very top. All of it stands on top of this. Somewhere up above you tonight, there is gold on the surface of things, a bright, expensive shine over the whole age, and I want you to hold a quiet thought as you drift, a thread we will follow all the way up. The gold on the surface had to come from somewhere. It had to be scraped from somewhere, from someone's hands, and the hands it started with are yours, here, tonight, at the bottom. Let your breathing slow a little more. There is no hurry. We have the whole night. Around you, if you could rise up above the rooftops and look down, you would see one of the most crowded patches of ground anywhere on the entire earth. This was the Lower East Side, and within it there was a district called the 10th Ward, and the 10th Ward was so packed with people that scholars who came later, trying to make the number believable, reached for comparisons to the most crowded cities on the far side of the world. They spoke of something near 700 people living on a single acre of land. 700 people on a patch of ground you could walk across in less than a minute. Stacked in floors, folded into rooms, sharing walls and shafts and stairs and the very air, 700 lives to the acre, breathing. The buildings that held all these people had a shape, and the shape had a name, and the name was almost tender for what it described. They called it the dumbbell tenement. If you looked down on one from directly above, its outline pinched inward in the middle, narrow at the waist and wider at the ends, like the old iron dumbbells a strongman might lift. And that pinch in the middle was the whole point, because when two of these buildings stood side by side, their pinched waists left that narrow slot between them. That slot was the air shaft you have been listening to all night. The shape was born from a competition. Back in 1879, a magazine with the very practical name of Plumber and Sanitary Engineer held a contest to design a better tenement, one that would bring light and air to poor families packed onto the long, narrow city lots. A man named James E. Ware won it. His plan, with its pinched middle and its shaft, was chosen as the best of the entries, the humane answer to a hard problem. And here is the quiet ache of it, the kind of thing worth holding gently as you fall asleep. The best answer anyone could design, the winning answer, the compassionate answer, still gave you that reeking 2-foot shaft to sleep beside. The reformers themselves would come to hate what they had blessed. Years later, after a new law in the very first year of the new century tried to fix these buildings, the old dumbbells got a name that made them sound like relics of a darker time. They called them the old law tenements, the ones built before anyone knew better, or before anyone was made to do better. But you are living in them now, tonight, when they are simply called home. Inside the flat, the walls are close, a small tenement apartment rented for something like $10 to $12 a month, and set that against the $1.25 a day, and you can feel the arithmetic tightening around the family like a belt. $10 or $12 a month, out of a wage that might, on a good week, bring $7 or $8 in the door. The numbers do not fit inside each other. And so the family did what families do when the numbers will not fit. They made the space carry more people than it was ever meant to carry. They took in boarders. A stranger, a single man, newly off the boat perhaps, would pay a few coins to sleep in the front room, and now there was a little more money coming in and a little less room to move. And when even that was not enough, families rented the same bed to more than one sleeper in shifts. A man who worked nights would sleep in the bed by day and rise and go out into the streets, and a man who worked days would come home and lie down in the same warm hollow the first man had left. The bed never fully cooled, the mattress was never empty. Sleep itself became a thing you took turns at, a resource shared out like bread. Picture it softly, without alarm. The room you are in tonight has held more sleepers than it has beds, and every one of them was as tired as you. And when the wage still would not stretch, the work followed the family home. This was called homework or piecework, and it filled the rooms with quiet labour long after the factory would have closed. You would sit by a lamp, the whole family gathered close for the light, and you would finish garments that had come home in a bundle. Or you would roll cigars, one after another, or you would assemble artificial flowers, petal by petal by petal, a whole spring's worth of blossoms that would never smell of anything, made by hands that had not seen a real meadow in years. Or you would crack nuts, or pull basting threads, or do whatever piece of some larger job could be broken small enough to be done at a tenement table. You were paid by the piece. A few cents for each one. A few cents. And so you did not do one, you did hundreds, and you did them fast, and the children did them too. Small fingers being good at small work, their eyes bending close to the lamp beside yours. Everyone earning a fraction of a cent at a time, until the fractions added up to something that might close the gap between the wage and the rent. Let that image stay soft as you breathe. A room at night, a single lamp, a family bent over a mountain of small identical tasks, the children's hands moving as steadily as the adults, paid a few cents for the lot. There is no drama in it, only the endless quiet arithmetic of survival, petal by petal, cigar by cigar, cent by cent. For water, you went out of the flat. A single cold water tap might serve an entire floor, a whole row of families lining up at one faucet for everything, for cooking and for washing and for drinking. Cold water only. If you wanted it warm, you heated it yourself on the stove, kettle by kettle. And the privy, the toilet, was very often out in the yard behind the building or shared in the hall, used by everyone, cleaned by no one in particular. In the deep cold of a New York winter, you crossed the yard to reach it, and in the thick heat of summer you smelled it from your window, mingling with everything the air shaft carried up. This was ordinary. This was not the worst of it, or the exception to it. This was simply the daily texture of a life lived at the bottom of the ladder, the tap on the landing, the privy in the yard, the shaft by the bed. And you grew used to all of it, because the alternative to growing used to it was to lie awake in despair, and you were far too tired for despair. You wanted only to sleep, the way you want only to sleep now. For a very long time, the people who lived comfortably in the wider city, the people uptown with their own quiet bedrooms and their own private taps, had no real idea any of this existed. They knew there were poor districts, of course, the way you know there is a far country you will never visit. But they had never seen inside a tenement flat, never seen the shaft or the shared bed or the children at the lamp. And then a man named Jacob Riis changed that. Riis was a newspaperman, an immigrant himself, and he had walked these streets for years as a police reporter, learning them in the dark. He got hold of a new invention, an early kind of flash powder that could throw a burst of harsh white light into a room for the length of a single photograph. And with it he went down into the tenements at night, and he made pictures of what he found. The crowded rooms, the sleeping children, the faces caught blinking in the sudden glare, people who had never been photographed in their lives, looking up from the very rooms the comfortable city had never imagined. In 1890, he gathered it all into a book, and he gave the book a title that was really an accusation aimed straight at his readers. He called it How the Other Half Lives. The other half. He was telling the comfortable half of the city that there was a whole other half living just downtown from them, in the shaft and the shared bed and the yard privy, and that they had been able to look away only because they had never been made to look. And now here were the photographs, the light thrown into the dark rooms, and they could not unsee them. It was one of the first times the ladder we are climbing was ever shown, top to bottom, to the people standing near its top. You are one of the faces in that book tonight, one of the sleepers the flash would have found. But you are asleep, or nearly, and the light does not wake you. Now, in all of this hardship there was, strange to say, one institution that would actually help you. One place that would answer when you knocked. It was not a government office, because in these years the government offered almost nothing to a poor family in a tenement. There was no safety net stitched by any law. If you fell, you simply fell. But there was a machine, a political machine, and its name in New York was Tammany Hall, and in this era its boss was a man named Richard Croker. Tammany was, on paper, a political organization, the local arm of a party. In practice, it was something older and simpler and more human than that. It was a vast web of favors. If your family was hungry in the winter, a Tammany man might see that a load of coal arrived at your door to keep the stove burning. If you needed work, a Tammany man might know of a job, on the docks or in the streets or in the city's own payrolls, and put your name forward. If the rent was impossible this month, a Tammany man might have a quiet word with someone, and the impossible might become merely difficult. If you were newly arrived and lost in a strange country whose language you did not yet speak, a Tammany man might stand beside you and help you become a citizen. And all of this help was real. The coal was warm, the job was true. The kindness, in its way, was genuine, but of course it was not free. What Tammany asked in return was your loyalty and your vote. When election day came, the machine remembered every load of coal and every job and every favour, and it expected you to remember too at the ballot box. The coal that arrived the night before an election was not an accident of timing. It was the whole arrangement made visible, warmth in exchange for a vote. A fair trade by the machine's own lights, and very often the only trade on offer. So Tammany became the immigrant's safety net precisely because no one else had bothered to build one. It caught you when you fell, and it charged you for the catching, and in a world with $1.25 a day and a shaft by your bed, you took the deal. Because it was the only deal there was. Let all of that settle now, gently, like dust coming to rest in a still room. The wage, the shaft, the shared bed and the lamp-lit piecework, and the children's small hands. The one cold tap on the landing and the privy across the yard, Rhys with his sudden light, showing the comfortable city the other half, and Tammany with its coal and its favours and its quiet price. This is the ground floor of the age. This is where the ladder begins, down here in the crowded dark of the 10th Ward. 700 souls to the acre, all of them as ready for sleep as you are becoming now. And here is the thing to carry upward with you as your thoughts begin to loosen and blur. None of this was separate from what lay above it. The $1.25 you earned was low precisely so that the goods you made could be cheap, and the cheap goods made someone else's fortune a little larger. The rent you could barely pay flowed upward into the pocket of a landlord, and from the landlord perhaps into something larger still. The petals and the cigars and the finished garments went out of the tenement and into the shops and the warehouses and the markets, and every few cents you were paid was a few cents shaved off the price, so that the difference could rise, floor by floor, up the very ladder we are going to climb. The building had an air shaft that carried the smell of your supper up past the windows above you. The Age had a shaft of its own, an invisible one, and it carried money the same way, upward, always upward, out of these rooms and into rooms you would never see. You did not think about it in these terms, of course. You were far too busy living. You thought about the rent and the coal, and whether the work would hold through the winter, and whether the boarder would pay on time, and whether the children were warm enough by the lamp. The great shape of the Age was invisible to you the way the shape of a mountain is invisible to the person standing on it. But it was there, and we are going to trace it, slowly, all the way to the top, and at each level up we will find someone standing where they stood, and we will feel the thread running up out of their hands into the hands above them. For now, though, stay here a moment longer in the warm, crowded dark. Let the air shaft become just a sound again, the way it did for everyone who ever slept beside one, a sound your body has decided is safe enough to ignore. Let the arithmetic of the rent and the wage go quiet, because tonight there is nothing to pay and nothing to earn and nothing at all you must do. Feel the bed beneath you hold your full weight, and let your breathing go slower still, and slower. The people who lived down here were not, most of them, from here at all. They had crossed an ocean to reach these rooms. They had come from villages and cities all over the far side of the world, drawn by the same shining word that hung over the whole country, the word that said there was more here, that a person could rise here, that the ladder had a top and that anyone might climb it. And some did climb. That was the strange, true, complicated promise at the heart of the Age. The ladder was real, and now and then a person truly did go up it. But most stayed near the bottom rung where they had landed, and did the piecework by the lamp, and slept beside the shaft, and traded their vote for coal, and raised children who might, if they were very fortunate, climb a single step higher than their parents had. A single step higher. That was the whole hope, most of the time. Not the marble palace at the summit, which no one down here could even picture. Just the next rung, just a flat with its own tap. Just work that held through the winter. Just a collar clean enough to be taken for something a little better than a labourer, though we have not reached the collar yet, and that is a rung for another part of the night. Because that is how the climb goes, one small step at a time, and we are going to take it that way too, unhurried, letting each level become real before we move up to the next. We have stood now on the ground floor in the tenement with the $1.25 and the shaft and the shared bed. We have met Reus with his flash and Croker with his coal. We have felt the invisible thread beginning to pull the money upward out of these rooms. And that is enough for the first rung. That is enough to have felt where the whole thing begins. So let your mind rest here for a breath. Picture the block from above one last time, the tenements shoulder to shoulder, the narrow shafts running up between them like dark seams, the lamplight glowing in 1,000 windows where families sit bent over their piecework late into the night. Picture the one cold tap on each landing and the line of pails beside it. Picture the coal wagon that will come round before the next election and the ledger of favours kept in the mind of the machine. Picture the 700 souls to the acre, breathing, sleeping in shifts, the bed never fully cooling, the whole crowded, warm human weight of the bottom of the ladder. And now let the picture soften at its edges. Let the tenements blur into a general glow. There is no need to hold any of it clearly. The facts have been laid down, one gentle layer over another, and they will keep whether you remember them or not. The $1.25. The shaft. The dumbbell shape that won a prize for being the kindest thing anyone could build, which was still not kind at all. The book that showed the other half to the half that had never looked. The coal that bought a vote. It is all here, resting in the dark with you, and above it, waiting, are all the other rungs, the factory hand and his 12-hour day, the clerk with his single starched collar, the shopkeeper on Main Street, the manager of the great new companies, the speculator watching numbers clatter across a ribbon of paper, and higher still the men who owned the trusts and the railroads, and higher than that the great fortunes, and at the very top, in a ballroom that held exactly the number of people who were said to matter, the glittering few. We will reach them all, floor by floor, slowly, on the nights to come, and on this one. But there is no reaching to be done just now. Just now you are still at the bottom, in the crowded quiet where the whole climb begins, and where the gold that shines so far above you was first, and always, being scraped from hands like these. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let the sound of the shaft fade to almost nothing. The money is rising somewhere far above you in the dark, floor by floor by floor, and we are going to follow it up, slowly, all the way to the top. But not yet. For now, simply rest here on the first rung, in the warm and crowded dark, and let yourself begin to drift. Because the climb is long and gentle, and there is all the time in the world. The second rung is harder than the first. You feel that almost immediately, the moment you step from the world of the tenement into the world of the mill. The tenement was crowded, and it was dark, and it smelled of other people's lives pressed against yours, through walls thin enough to hear breathing through. But the mill is something else. The mill is where the day stops belonging to you at all. You rise before the sun has any interest in rising. That is the first thing. In the tenement the morning came in weak and late through a window that faced an air shaft, and even that pale smudge of light felt like something. In the mill town the morning is irrelevant. The shift begins when the shift begins, and the whistle does not care what the sky is doing. You have perhaps a tin cup of something hot if there is fuel for it, and a piece of bread if there is bread. And then you walk. You walk through streets that are still dark, in a town that exists entirely because the mill exists, and you walk with dozens of other men who are also walking in the dark, and none of you are particularly speaking, because it is early and because there is nothing to say that the whistle has not already said. The standard shift in a steel mill in the 1880s and 1890s is 12 hours. That is not 12 hours with a long midday rest and a comfortable chair and an open window. That is 12 hours in the heat and the noise and the orange light of furnaces that do not cool down and are not supposed to. John A. Fitch wrote about it in his book about the steel workers, published in 1910. And the picture he drew was of a working day that consumed the waking man almost entirely. Because 12 hours of shift, and the walk to and from, and whatever time you need to eat and sleep, leaves perhaps 4 or 5 hours of something else. And those hours contain everything the rest of life is supposed to hold. They contain your children's faces. They contain the small conversation across a table. They contain whatever rest a body that has been standing in front of a furnace for 12 hours might be able to find before it has to go back and do it again. The average manufacturing work week in 1890 ran to roughly 60 hours, 6 days, 10 hours a day, or in the steel mills, 12. That is the arithmetic of a life organized around the needs of the furnace and not around the needs of the man. And the furnace had to run. The furnace was always running. It was running the day you arrived, and it would be running the day you left, and the whole organization of your hours was simply a question of which part of its running you were there to tend. Every 2 weeks, the day shift and the night shift swapped. That was the logic of the operation. A necessary exchange that kept the mill at full capacity day and night. And when they swapped, one crew worked the long turn. You will have heard this phrase, perhaps, or you will hear it now and understand it immediately, because the words are plain, and the thing they describe is plain. The long turn was 24 hours. When your crew crossed from days to nights, or from nights back to days, there was a shift in between that no one could be spared from, and so someone worked it. Often everyone worked it. You came in at your usual hour and you worked your 12, and then instead of leaving you stayed and you worked another 12, 24 hours in the heat and the light of the furnace and the clang of the metal and the noise that never stopped, because the furnace never stopped, because the furnace was the point of everything. Imagine what 24 hours beside a furnace does to a body. Imagine what it does to the hands, to the eyes, to the particular quality of the air you are breathing, which is not the air of anywhere comfortable, but the air of a steel mill, full of dust and heat, and the particular smell of metal being worked at temperatures that can reduce it to something pourable. Imagine the last few hours of it, the hours before you were finally allowed to walk back through the dark to the room you slept in. The body simply continues, because the body has no other option, and because the rent is due, and because the mill does not keep a man who does not show up for his shift. There was, in this life, no workers' compensation. There was nothing that served that function, nothing that filled that space. If you were injured, and injury was common, because steel mills and coal mines and factory floors were places where the machinery did not pause for a misplaced hand, where a coupling on a railroad car could catch you wrong and take something from you that you would not get back. If you were injured, you simply lost your job. That was the sum of it. The job went to the next man, who was waiting. And you went wherever a man with a lost hand or a crushed foot and no income could go, which in most cases was somewhere very difficult. The industrial death rate in these years was not a statistic that sat quietly in a ledger somewhere. It was a regular feature of life in the towns where the mills and the mines were. Railroads killed and maimed thousands a year. From accidents with the old-style link and pin couplings that required a worker to stand between the cars and guide them together, a maneuver that took a finger or a hand or more if the timing was wrong. The steel mills had their own particular catalogue of ways a man could be hurt. And after the hurt, there was only the street. The 1900 census counted roughly 1.75 million children under the age of 16 at work in the United States. 1.75 million. In the anthracite coalfields of Pennsylvania, the children were called breaker boys. They sat hunched over the long chutes where crushed coal poured down from above, and their job was to pick out the slate. The waste rock mixed in with the coal with their bare hands. The coal was dusty and sharp-edged, and their fingers bled, and the dust went into their lungs in a way that did not come back out. They were often 9 years old, sometimes 12. They sat in the noise and the dark and the coal dust, and they sorted with their hands, hour after hour, because their family needed what those hours paid. And because the mine needed what those hands could do, and because no one had yet managed to successfully argue that a boy of 9 had any other claim on his morning. Hold that image for a moment. A boy of 9 with black and bleeding hands in the dark of a coal breaker. Hold it, and then hold beside it the other image, the one that is waiting higher up on the ladder, of a ballroom in New York that held exactly 400 people who were said to be the only ones who truly mattered. Both of these things were happening at the same time, in the same country, under the same word, gilded. We will reach the ballroom. But not yet. In 1892, the town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, sat on the south bank of the Monongahela River, a few miles east of Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Steel had a plant there, one of the largest and most productive steelworks in the world, because Andrew Carnegie had spent years making it so, had spent years driving efficiency into every part of the operation, had spent years insisting on the latest technology and the best processes, and the result was a plant that could produce steel more cheaply than almost anyone else on Earth. The workers at that plant had a union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and the union had a contract, and the contract was coming up for renewal in the summer of 1892. Andrew Carnegie was not in Homestead that summer. Andrew Carnegie was in Scotland, at his castle, Skibo Castle, which he had leased and would eventually buy, and where he spent his summers enjoying the landscape and the distance from the noise of the American industry that had made him wealthy enough to be there. He left the Homestead negotiation to his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick. And Henry Clay Frick was not a man who negotiated in the way the word usually implies. Frick locked the workers out. He cut the wages the union had been offered, and when the union refused the new terms, he shut the plant, and he ordered a fence built around it, a fence topped with barbed wire and fitted with observation posts, which the workers almost immediately renamed Fort Frick. And then he hired the Pinkertons. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was, among other things, a private army available to businesses that needed men with rifles and the willingness to use them. Frick hired 300 of them. He arranged for them to arrive by river, because arriving by road would have meant walking through the town and through the workers who were standing outside the fence they had just been locked out of. So the Pinkertons came on barges up the Monongahela River in the early hours of July 6, 1892, in the dark, which was perhaps a reasonable approach to moving 300 armed men toward a workforce that was not going to be happy to see them. The workers saw them anyway. Word travelled, and men came to the riverbank, and when the barges tried to land there was a confrontation that became a gun battle, and the gun battle went on for the better part of a day. When it was over, roughly 10 people were dead. The Pinkertons eventually surrendered, which did not save them from being beaten by the crowd as they were marched through the town. The state militia arrived not long after and broke the strike, and the union was effectively destroyed, and the plant reopened with non-union labour, and the 12-hour shift and the long turn continued, and Carnegie Steel continued to produce steel more cheaply than almost anyone else on Earth. Carnegie, in Scotland, received the news by telegram. He wrote to Frick afterward to say that the whole matter had been handled as well as it could have been. He was the man who, 3 years earlier, had written an essay called Wealth, in which he argued that the rich were merely trustees of their fortunes and were obligated to give it all away. He was the man who would go on to build roughly 2,500 public libraries around the world, about 1,700 of them in the United States, so that anyone who wanted to read could walk in off the street and find a book waiting. Remember his name. We will meet him again, higher up. 2 years after Homestead, in the summer of 1894, the trouble moved to Illinois. George Pullman had built something he called a model town south of Chicago, a town that bore his own name, which he had constructed beginning in 1880 as a place where his workers could live in decent housing with gas and running water and a library and a church, all of which were owned by the Pullman Palace Car Company, and all of which the workers paid for through their wages. They rented company houses, they bought from company stores. The rent was deducted from their paychecks before they ever saw them. When the Depression of 1893 hit and orders for Pullman sleeping cars fell, George Pullman cut wages. He cut them by somewhere between 25% and 40%, depending on the job. He did not cut the rents. The reasoning, which he explained without apparent discomfort, was that the town and the factory were separate enterprises, and the rent was a separate matter from the wage, and so one had nothing to do with the other. The workers, who were paying rent from wages that had just been cut while the rent itself had not changed, found this logic less than satisfying. They stopped working. And then a man named Eugene V. Debs, who led an organization called the American Railway Union, turned a local dispute at a company town in Illinois into something the country had not quite seen before. The American Railway Union's members refused to handle any train that included Pullman cars. Pullman cars were on most trains. The railroads began attaching mail cars to Pullman cars, which meant that refusing to handle a Pullman car meant refusing to handle the mail, which under federal law meant something different and much more serious than a labor dispute. The federal government obtained an injunction. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. Eugene Debs was arrested. The strike was broken. Pullman, Illinois had gas and running water and a library. It had decent houses with small gardens, nicer by some measure than the tenements of the Lower East Side. And the man who owned all of it, who owned the houses and the stores and the church, and set the wages and the rents, had simply decided that when money got tight, the wages would go down and the rents would stay the same, and that this was his right, because it was his town. He had built it. It bore his name. That is one kind of life at the second rung. The factory hand's life. The coal breaker's life. The homestead man's life. The Pullman man's life. 12 hours and a long turn, and no compensation for what the machine took from you, and no recourse when the man who owned the machine decided what you owed him was more than what he owed you. The gold being scraped from hands like yours. Remember that. We are climbing. There is a rung above the factory floor, and it looks different enough from the outside that men worked very hard to stay on the right side of that difference. The difference was not, in honest terms, a very large one. The clerk who sat at a desk in a counting house or a dry goods office earned perhaps $800 a year. Perhaps 1,500 if he had been there long enough and done well enough. That is more than the factory hands 400 or 500, but it is not a different world. It is not a world of ease. It is a world of careful management, of the mathematics of respectability, of knowing which expenses are non-negotiable because they are the ones that mark you as belonging on this side of the line and not the other. The line was, to a considerable degree, visible. It was visible in the way a man dressed. in the particular whiteness of his collar, in whether he arrived at work with his hands already blackened, or arrived clean and left clean. The factory hand's labour showed on him. The clerk's labour, if it went well, did not. And in a world where the difference between the man at the desk and the man at the machine was not one of wealth, but largely of appearance and manner, appearance and manner became the things worth spending money on, even when money was not plentiful. The detachable collar was, in this sense, one of the small and elegant solutions the era produced. A starched white collar was the signal of respectability, the visible sign that you were the kind of man who worked with his mind and a pen rather than with his back and his hands. But starched white collars got dirty. They wilted. They needed washing and pressing cost time and money that many clerks could not easily spare. And so someone had the practical idea of making the collar detachable, of engineering it so that it could be buttoned onto a cheaper shirt, worn until it needed cleaning, then unhooked and laundered on its own, while the shirt was worn again with a different collar. The woman most often credited with this idea was Hannah Montague of Troy, New York, in the 1820s, though the idea took decades to become an industry. By the Gilded Age, Troy had become the centre of the detachable collar trade, a manufacturing hub so completely given over to the production of these small badges of respectability that it was known simply as Collar City. The mills there turned out starched white collars in quantities that made them affordable for men who could not have afforded to replace a whole shirt every few days, and those men wore them to offices across the country as proof of something that went beyond the garment itself. One good collar. That is what you owned. Perhaps two, so that one could be at the laundry while the other was at your throat, and with that collar in place, and a ready-made suit purchased off the rack from one of the clothiers who had been producing men's clothing in standard sizes since the Civil War had made the measurement of mass bodies a logistical necessity, with those things in order. You could walk into a counting house or an office and be taken for what you were presenting yourself as. A man of a certain kind, a man who worked with his mind. The skills that made you that kind of man were specific and learnable, and men learned them deliberately. Spencerian penmanship was one. It is difficult now to convey exactly what a particular style of handwriting meant in a world where nearly all business communication was done by hand, where a letter or a ledger entry was also, inescapably, a piece of visible craft, but Spencerian script, with its flowing, slanted loops and its careful precision, was the style taught in business schools and counting houses as the mark of a trained and reliable hand. You practiced it. You practiced it until it looked effortless, which is what all the best skills look like from the outside. And the men who could produce it quickly and clearly were more hireable than the men who could not, because the men who could produce it were legible, and legibility was a form of trustworthiness, when trust was what the ledger required. Alongside the penmanship was the bookkeeping, the double-entry ledger, the careful record of what came in and what went out, and what was owed and what was owing, maintained in columns that had to balance to the penny, because a penny off in a ledger was a sign of something wrong, and something wrong in the accounts was something no merchant or manager wanted to discover. Bookkeeping was a trade in the older sense, a skill with a price, a thing you could sell to someone who needed it, and the men who had it were employed, which was the most important thing a man could be, in an era when not being employed meant the difference between the respectable address and the tenement. And then, in 1874, the Remington Arms Company put on sale a machine that would, over the next 2 decades, change the office in ways no one fully anticipated. The Remington typewriter. It was not the first typewriter, but it was the first to be commercially successful, the first to move from the category of curiosity into the category of tool. And as it moved through the 1880s and into the 1890s, it brought with it a transformation of the clerical world that the men already in that world did not entirely welcome. The machine and the operator, for a while, shared a name. If you hired a typewriter, you hired both the device and the person who worked it. And the person who worked it, increasingly, was a young woman. This was not an accident. Office work had been, before the typewriter, a male preserve. The counting house with its rows of male clerks copying correspondence by hand was a male space, and a fairly well-guarded one. But the typewriter was new, and new things carry less of the weight of tradition. There was no long history of men doing this particular work, because this particular work had not existed before. And the wages paid to the young women who came to fill the new positions were lower than the wages that would have had to be paid to men to do the same thing. The business logic was, as business logic often was in this era, direct and unsentimental. The young woman who sat at the Remington typewriter in the 1880s and 1890s, she who was called a typewriter along with the machine she operated, was doing something genuinely new. She was entering a professional space that had not had much room for her before. She brought with her a set of skills, the ability to operate the machine, to work at a pace the machine allowed, to produce clean and readable copy in quantities that a hand-copying clerk would have taken much longer to match. And she did this for wages that kept her, in most cases, below the earnings of the male clerk at the next desk, and in a position that was new enough not to have accumulated much in the way of protection or tradition. But she was there, and her presence was one of the small, permanent changes the Gilded Age made to the shape of American working life, a change that looked, at the time, like a simple, cost-saving measure, and that turned out to be something considerably larger. The clerk who had a steady position and a white collar and perhaps a growing set of skills, the penmanship, the bookkeeping, the ability to operate the new machines, this clerk was doing something else that was new, something the factory hand below him could not easily do. He was commuting. He was living somewhere other than where he worked. The streetcar made this possible. Horse-drawn at first, then electrified in the late 1880s and 1890s, the streetcar lines spread out from the centers of American cities into the new neighborhoods growing at their edges, and along those lines went the clerks and the minor professionals and the small men of the lower middle, renting rooms or small houses in places that were not the tenement blocks, not the rooming houses above the saloon, not the crowded streets where the factory workers and the recent immigrants lived. The streetcar suburb was not luxurious. It was a rented room or a modest house on a modest street, without much extra space and without much extra money. But it was separate. It was a place where you were not sleeping in the same building as a boarder who worked the night shift, not sharing a cold water tap with 4 other families, not hearing the air shaft all night, carrying the sounds of the building above and below you. The separation was partly practical, but it was also, and perhaps more fundamentally, a statement. To live somewhere other than where you worked, to make the daily journey from home to office and back again, was to claim a certain kind of identity. You were the kind of man who had a home and a workplace, and they were not the same place. You were the kind of man who moved between a private life and a professional one, and kept them in separate rooms, separate streets, separate parts of the day. That movement, the walk to the streetcar stop in the morning, the ride in with the other commuters, the office and the collar and the careful penmanship all day, and then the ride back to the quieter street in the evening. That movement was, for the Gilded Age clerk, a form of dignity. It was the rung he was standing on, and he knew it, and he held on to it carefully. The distance between him and the factory hand was not, in most cases, a great deal of money. It was a collar, it was a set of learnable skills, it was the particular quality of the work that his hands were not the instrument of it, that the product he made was a number in a column or a letter in a file rather than a piece of steel or a heap of sorted coal. But distance does not have to be large to be real, and the clerk felt this distance as very real, because for the clerk it was the most important fact of his working life, the thing that organized his spending and his dress and his address and his careful maintenance of the appearance of a man who had not fallen back to the rung below. He had not fallen. He was holding, and holding in the Gilded Age, on the rung just above the factory floor, required a particular kind of daily effort that nobody with a grander position was required to exert in quite that way. The effort of the man who is exactly one step above where he cannot afford to be, and who knows it, and who starts every morning by putting on the one good collar that says he is still standing where he is, standing. Somewhere in an office in a building in a city, a young man is copying a letter in Spencerian script, and the curve of his hand on the paper is practised and clean, and the collar at his throat is stiff with starch. And in the room next to him, a young woman is working the keys of a Remington with a rhythm that the young man cannot quite match. And neither of them knows yet what the typewriter will eventually do to the world they are both, in their different ways, carefully inhabiting. It is 1889, or thereabouts. The evening streetcar will come at a certain hour and carry them both back toward the neighborhoods where they rent their separate rooms, and tomorrow the collar will go back on, and the ledger will go back in the drawer, and the machine will begin its clattering again, and the day will proceed as the day before it proceeded, because that is what stability feels like from the inside, the repetition of the same careful acts that keep you on your rung. Let the sound of the typewriter fade a little. Let the scratch of the pen on the ledger page go quiet. You are climbing still, and the rungs above are becoming wider and stranger and more complicated, and the money is moving differently, and the men handling it are handling it in quantities that the clerk with his $800 a year cannot quite imagine. But there is no hurrying. The night is long, and the climb is slow, and somewhere between this rung and the next you can simply rest for a moment in the quiet of it. The collar is starched. The ledger balances. The streetcar is coming. Let yourself soften into that. Let the particular dignity of the careful man, the man holding his rung with both hands, settle over you like something warm. He is not glamorous. He is not one of the men whose name will be in the newspaper. But he is here, and he is steady, and his hands are clean, and the collar at his throat is white, and that is enough for tonight. The next rung is waiting. The proprietor on Main Street, with his general store and his running ledger and the thick catalogue that arrived by mail and threatened to make him unnecessary. The manager of the new corporation, learning for the first time what it meant to have a career instead of a trade. The speculator in a hotel lobby watching numbers clatter across a ribbon of paper and feeling the future arrive in the shape of a machine. All of it is waiting, quiet and unhurried, in the dark above you, each floor lit by its own particular light. We will reach them all. Not tonight. Not yet. For now, let your breathing slow a little. Let your hands go still. You have climbed 2 rungs tonight, from the tenement to the factory floor, from the factory floor to the counting house, and that is enough of a climb for any night. The world of the Gilded Age is settling around you in the dark, like something you have always known the outline of, but never quite stood inside before, and there is more of it to come. More texture, and more distance, and more of the invisible thread that runs from the bottom to the top, pulling, but the thread will still be there when you wake, and the climb will still be there, and the whole long ladder will be waiting exactly where you left it, stretching up into a dark you have not yet seen. Let it wait. Let your jaw go easy. Let the streetcar and the factory whistle and the sound of the Monongahela go soft in the distance, far from where you are, which is somewhere quiet and still, somewhere between the collar and the coal dust, somewhere in the long, unhurried middle of the night. The ladder holds you there a moment, suspended between the counting house and the next rung up, and there is no hurry. The night is patient. The distance between each level is real. You can feel it. The way you feel the difference in air between a basement and an upper floor, the slight change in pressure, the different quality of quiet. Each rung has its own particular gravity, and the one just above you is already beginning to take shape in the dark. You are on Main Street now. Not the Main Street of anyone's memory exactly, not the one softened by nostalgia or painted over by time, but the original, the one that smelled of flour dust and harness leather and the particular sweetness of dried apples kept in a barrel near the door. The general store on a Gilded Age Main Street was not merely a place to buy things. It was the nervous system of a small community, the place where information moved and debts were recorded and trust was extended in the form of credit, which is to say in the form of belief that a person would still be there next season to settle what they owed. You ran the place, or your father did, or your grandfather, and you have grown up behind the counter the way some people grow up beside a river, knowing every current and eddy by the feel of the water against your skin. The ledger is the thing, not the goods on the shelves, not the canisters of coffee, or the bolts of printed calico, or the coils of rope hanging from the ceiling hooks. The ledger is where the store actually lives. The long-lined book, with every customer's name running down the margin and their purchases accumulating in columns across the page. A sack of cornmeal in February, a yard of flannel, 2 pounds of nails, which means a fence being mended, which means the winter has been hard on the property. You know what the numbers mean before you write them down, because you know the people. And knowing the people is what makes the credit possible. A farmer who has farmed the same ground for 20 years and kept a clean account and always settled by harvest, you extend that man credit because you know the land and the family and the particular way they have of making do. That knowledge is invisible, but it is worth something, and it lives only in your memory and in the ledger, and nowhere else in the world. The settlement came at harvest. A farmer would come in with cash or trade goods, a side of cured pork, a bushel of potatoes, and the running account would close for another season. Some years it closed cleanly. Other years there was a shortfall, and you carried it forward, and both of you understood what it meant, and neither said more than was necessary. The social order of a small town in the 1870s and 1880s ran on a kind of sustained mutual pretense that everyone was doing a little better than they were, and the ledger was the private document where the actual arithmetic lived, away from the pretense, truthful in the way that only numbers can be. You knew everyone's debts and everyone's needs, which meant you also knew everyone's secrets. The man who buys a second bottle of patent medicine every 3 weeks. The family whose flour consumption drops in the months before the oldest daughter marries, which tells you something about how the household is preparing. The widow who comes in every Thursday and always lingers near the stove because her house is cold and the store is warm, and there is no social shame in the errand that brings her here. You are not merely a merchant. You are the keeper of a small town's private ledger, and the trust that runs through it is a form of intimacy that no catalogue from Chicago could ever replicate. But the catalogue was coming. It arrived the way most disruptions arrive, quietly at first, by mail, looking harmless. Montgomery Ward had been sending out a single printed sheet of prices since 1872, targeting farmers who felt, rightly, that the middleman between the manufacturer and the rural household had been taking too large a cut for too long. By the 1880s, that single sheet had become a book, and by the early 1890s, it had become the kind of book that earned a name, the Wish Book. Sears Roebuck followed in 1893, and the catalogue it produced was thick enough to hold a door open, dense with illustrations and prices and the accumulated promise of everything a household could want delivered to the nearest rail station, and then. Once rural free delivery finally reached the most remote farms, delivered directly to the door. Imagine holding one of those catalogues for the first time, the sheer weight of it, the smell of the ink, the improbable density of choice, 100 pages of women's clothing, 30 pages of farm tools, watches, sewing machines, bicycles, parlor organs, rifles, buggy harness, sheet music, patent medicine, eyeglasses, everything with a price printed next to it in plain black type. No negotiation required, no reading of a face to know if you were being fairly dealt with. The price was the price. It was the same price whether you were the mayor's wife or the tenant farmer's daughter, whether you had been a loyal customer for 20 years or had never set foot in the store. The catalogue offered something the general store could not, and the thing it offered was anonymity, which turns out to be a form of equality. The mail-order houses could undercut your prices because they bought in quantities that no single Main Street merchant could match, and because the railroad connected them to the whole country at once rather than to one county at a time. The same expanding rail network that carried the immigrant to the factory and the factory's goods to the port carried the catalogue's merchandise outward into every county and township in the nation. Rural free delivery, the federal postal system that brought mail directly to farm households rather than requiring a trip to town, arrived in 1896. And when it did, the last remaining advantage of proximity began to dissolve. You could stand in your store on a Tuesday morning and watch a farmer's wife step off the platform at the depot with a parcel she had ordered by mail 3 weeks ago. A parcel that contained exactly the bolt of calico you had priced at $1.25 a yard, bought from a printed page for 80 cents. It was slow, this disruption. It did not close you overnight. The general store on Main Street would survive into the next century and beyond, carried by the things no catalogue could provide, the credit, the knowledge, the warmth near the stove, the social ritual of the errand itself. But something had shifted, and you could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. A slight drop in pressure, a smell in the air that doesn't belong to the season. The same logic that the great industrialists were applying to steel and oil, buy in volume, rationalize the supply chain, extract the middleman's margin and keep it, was being applied, quietly and by mail, to the bolt of calico and the can of baking powder and the pair of work boots that had always been yours to sell. The thread was pulling upward. It always was. But from the middle rungs you could not yet see where it was going. Let the catalogue close. Let the smell of flour dust and harness leather soften and fall away. You are climbing again, and the next rung is different from anything that came before it, because the rung above the Main Street merchant is not a factory or a farm or a courtroom or a bank vault. It is an office, specifically the kind of office that had not existed 20 years earlier, the kind of office that the age was inventing as it went, because the machines of the age had grown too large for any one person to run by sight and by instinct and by the knowledge of a single mind. You are a manager now, not an owner, not a founder, not an heir, a manager. And this distinction, which might seem like a merely technical one, is in fact one of the most radical things the Gilded Age produced. More quietly radical, perhaps, than the trusts or the ticker tape, because it was so gradual and so logical that almost no one noticed it happening until the world had already been remade around it. The railroads did it first, because the railroads had to. A railroad connecting New York to Chicago, running hundreds of locomotives over thousands of miles of track, employing tens of thousands of workers in a dozen different states, buying coal and steel and lumber in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to any merchant of the previous generation. No single person could hold all of that in their head. The owner could not stand at the end of the platform and inspect every transaction. The original entrepreneur who had fought for the right of way and laid the first rails was, by the time the system reached maturity, presiding over something too vast and too complex for the methods that had built it. So the railroads began to build something else, a layer of salaried professionals between the owner and the work, men who did not own the enterprise but who understood it in its parts. The superintendent of the Western Division, the traffic manager, the chief accountant, the purchasing agent, the general counsel, each responsible for one particular slice of the operation, each reporting upward through a hierarchy of authority toward the man at the top. The historian Alfred D. Chandler, writing much later in a book called The Visible Hand, gave this development its most precise name. Adam Smith had written about the invisible hand of the market, the impersonal mechanism by which prices and competition guided economic activity without anyone directing it. Chandler's argument was that the great Gilded Age corporations had replaced that invisible hand with a visible one, the hand of professional management, of deliberate planning, of cost accounting and organizational hierarchy. The market was no longer deciding, in many industries, how goods moved from producer to consumer. Management was deciding, with ledgers and flowcharts and chains of command, because for an operation of sufficient scale, management was more efficient than the market's impersonal signals. What this produced at the human level was a genuinely new kind of life. A life organized around the concept of a career rather than a trade. A trade was something you knew how to do. You were a blacksmith, a printer, a weaver, and you did it in more or less the same way for the rest of your working years. A career was something you moved through, ascending a hierarchy by demonstrating competence, accumulating authority, drawing a larger salary at each stage. You did not own the railway whose trains you scheduled. You did not own the steel company whose costs you tracked in monthly reports. But you were not interchangeable with the man below you either. You had mastered something, cost accounting, traffic management, the particular science of moving materials from one point to another at the minimum expenditure of money and time, and that mastery was worth a salary, and the salary grew as the mastery deepened. And the ladder of the organization was a second version of the great ladder of the age itself, running from the clerk at the bottom to the general manager at the top. Each rung defined by what you controlled and what you knew. It was a comfortable life by the standards of the age. You earned perhaps $1,200 or $1,500 a year or more as you rose. You lived in a respectable neighborhood, rented or owned a house with a parlor and a proper dining room and a garden plot. Your wife did not do homework by lamplight or take in boarders. Your children attended school, perhaps for years beyond what the immigrant's family could dream of. You wore a good suit, not the detachable collar of the clerk, but a suit of actual wool. And you carried a pocket watch, and the watch ran on time because your whole professional life ran on time, measured and scheduled and accounted for in ways that the factory hand's 12 hours would have recognized only as a different kind of imprisonment. But it was not imprisonment, or not experienced as such, because what the managerial life offered was legibility. The sense that the work made sense, that you could see where you stood and where you might go, that the effort you put in was connected in a visible and traceable way to the reward you received. The factory hand worked 12 hours and received his wage, and the connection between work and reward was brute and mechanical. The manager worked differently, accountably, with a set of responsibilities that could be evaluated and that could justify, in the language of the organization, a claim on higher salary and greater authority. The career was a machine for turning demonstrated competence into status and income over time, and it was so compelling an invention that most of the working lives lived in the industrialized world for the next 150 years would be organized around some version of it. For now, though, it was new. The corner office, the monthly cost report, the organizational chart pinned to the wall. These were fresh technologies, as novel in their way as the steam press or the Bessemer converter, and the men who inhabited them were still learning what they meant, still feeling the edges of this new social position that had no precedent in the world their fathers had known. A manager's son in 1885 was the first generation to inherit not a trade or a property, but a credential, an education, a set of demonstrated professional skills. That was something. It was also, quietly, the beginning of a new kind of anxiety. The anxiety of a life whose security rested not on land or capital, but on continued institutional approval, on being seen to be useful, on never quite losing the thread of demonstrated competence that justified the salary and the suit and the pocket watch that ran exactly on time. There is something restful at this distance in watching it all from the outside. The office lamp lit against the evening, the columns of figures in the cost ledger, the quiet hum of an organization too large and too complex to be angry at or grateful toward, just present and ongoing and requiring the particular kind of attention that a good manager learns to provide. It is almost peaceful to imagine. The visible hand moving with such deliberate calm through the complexity of the age. Let that calm settle a little. Let the office recede. Because the next rung is louder, faster, more dangerous, and it begins with a sound. It is a small sound, mechanical and repetitive, a clicking and stuttering that you might almost mistake for a telegraph key if you did not know what it was. But you do know, because everyone in this hotel lobby knows, because the machine in the corner near the window has been there for several years now, and its presence has altered the atmosphere of the room in a way that is difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The machine is about the size of a hat box. It runs a continuous ribbon of paper tape, and on that tape, letter by letter, number by number, it prints the prices of stocks traded on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. This is the stock ticker, and it has changed everything about what it means to speculate. Before the ticker, financial news travelled at the speed of a messenger, which is to say at the speed of a man's legs through the streets of Lower Manhattan. A broker on the exchange floor would complete a trade, and someone would have to physically carry that price to the offices and counting houses that needed to know it. By the time a price reached a buyer 2 miles from the exchange, it was already old. The market was, in a practical sense, a local phenomenon. You had to be near it to know it. And knowing it late was the same as not knowing it at all. Edward Callahan changed this in 1867 when he invented the first stock ticker, a device that could transmit prices by telegraph wire and print them automatically on a continuous strip of paper. 2 years later, in 1869, Thomas Edison produced an improved version called the Universal Stock Ticker, and the technology became reliable enough to spread widely. Hotels installed the machines in their lobbies. Brokerage offices kept them running during market hours. A man in Philadelphia or Boston or Baltimore could now receive prices from the New York Exchange with only a few minutes' delay, the tape unspooling in his hand as the market moved. The numbers arriving almost as fast as they were made. Imagine the first time you held a strip of that tape in your fingers. The paper was thin, narrow, barely an inch wide, printed in small black figures, the abbreviated name of the company, then the price, then the number of shares. Erie RR 52 1/4, New York Central 108, Union Pacific 87 3-8. Each number a fact about a world operating simultaneously somewhere else, a world of buying and selling that you could now track from a leather chair in a hotel lobby, watching the future arrive one printed character at a time. The ticker made the market present in a way it had never been before, not a distant place you might visit or hear about second-hand, but a constant, running, audible event, unfolding in real time in the corner of whatever room you happened to occupy. The temptation was obvious and almost irresistible. If you knew the price now, and you could buy or sell on that knowledge before the next price arrived, then you had an edge. And if you understood something about the larger forces moving a particular stock, the railroad's plans, the harvest, the political wind, you might have a very large edge indeed, large enough to turn a modest sum into a significant one over the course of an afternoon. This is the tier of the speculator. Not the great financier who controlled companies and reorganized industries. We will meet those men later, and they operated on a different scale entirely. But the speculator proper, the man or sometimes the woman who watched the tape and made bets on which way the numbers would move. The speculator occupied a peculiar social position in the Gilded Age, simultaneously celebrated and condemned, because speculation was understood to be gambling, and gambling was a moral failing, and yet the men who had built the great railroad and industrial fortunes had all, at some point in their careers, made enormous speculative bets that turned out correct. The line between speculation and investment was wherever you chose to draw it, which meant the line was always moving. At the top of the speculative world stood figures like Jay Gould, whose relationship to the stock market was less that of a participant than of a sovereign, a man capable of creating or destroying prices by the force of his own moves, manipulating the tape as an instrument of strategy rather than merely reading it as a source of information. Jay Gould and his partner Jim Fisk demonstrated this capacity most dramatically on September 24, 1869, in an event that came to be called Black Friday, though it happened in a season of gold and green. The plan was this. Gould and Fisk had concluded that they could corner the entire gold market, buying up enough physical gold and gold contracts to control the price, and then selling at a profit when the trapped market had to pay whatever they demanded. This required one crucial thing. They needed to be confident that the federal government would not release its own gold reserves to break the corner. To secure that assurance, they worked through President Ulysses Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, who they hoped could convince Grant to keep the Treasury's gold locked up while the price rose. For a few days, it seemed to be working. Gold rose. September 24 opened with gold trading at $150 for a $100 face value, and it went higher as Gould and Fisk bought, the market tightening around them, the trapped sellers facing ruinous obligations if the price kept climbing. The ticker clattered in hotel lobbies across New York and beyond, and men who had borrowed to bet on gold watched the numbers with a rising sensation that was part exhilaration and part nausea. The particular physiological register of watching a bet run in your direction on borrowed time. Then the Treasury released gold. Grant, who had apparently grown suspicious of the scheme, authorized the sale of $4 million of government gold, and the price collapsed, not gradually, not with warning, but in minutes, the ticker printing the collapse almost faster than it could be read. Men who had been momentarily rich by the numbers on the tape were ruined before the tape stopped moving. The corner broke, and with it broke the savings and the credit lines and the nervous systems of a wave of smaller speculators who had been caught in the middle of something too large for any of them to have controlled or escaped. Gould had quietly begun selling before the collapse. He lost something, but not what the men below him lost. This was the nature of the speculative tier. The tape was the same for everyone, the same price, the same number, arriving at the same moment in every lobby and office where the ticker ran. But the information behind the tape, the knowledge of what would move the price and when and why, was not the same for everyone. The great operators knew things that the ordinary speculator did not, and in some cases they had arranged those things themselves, which meant they were not reading the market, but writing it, the tape their instrument rather than their source of truth. Watered stock worked on a similar principle. The term came from the practice of feeding cattle salt and water before bringing them to market, so that the animals absorbed enough liquid to make them weigh significantly more than they actually did. The buyer paid for water. In the financial version, a promoter would issue shares in a company at a capitalization far exceeding the real value of the company's assets. The stock was printed, sold to the public, and the proceeds pocketed. The company might be real, might produce real goods, or operate real services, but the shares outstanding represented a much larger claim on the enterprise than the enterprise could honestly support. The investor who bought at the offered price was in effect buying salt water and paying for beef. There were bucket shops for those who could not afford even the modest commission of a legitimate brokerage. A bucket shop was, in the plainest terms, a place where you could bet on price movements without actually owning any underlying stock. You put down a margin, a few dollars, sometimes less, and made your guess about whether the price would rise or fall. If you were right, you collected. If you were wrong, you lost your margin. The bucket shop's proprietor covered the bets in aggregate, profiting from the losing positions while paying the winners from that pool. It was gambling with the vocabulary of finance, accessible to men who earned a wage rather than a salary, who had no account at a proper brokerage and no relationship with the men who knew things in advance and could read the tape with the additional information of what they had already arranged. And the panics came. They came with the regularity of something structural rather than accidental, which is what they were. The speculative tier sat directly beneath the tier of the great operators, and when the operators moved, when a corner broke, when a major house failed, when the tide of leveraged debt turned and began to run the other way, the reversal moved down through the system faster than the ticker could print it. September 18th, 1873, brought the first great panic of the era. J. Cook and Company, the banking house that had financed the Northern Pacific Railroad, could not sell enough railroad bonds to service the debts it had already committed to, and on that September morning it closed its doors. The news reached the New York Stock Exchange by mid-morning, and the floor, which had been crowded and loud with the ordinary noise of trading, became a different kind of loud, the panic loud of men trying to sell at once into a market where no one was buying. The exchange closed for 10 days. It was the longest closure in its history to that point. What followed was a depression that lasted, in most economic estimates, until the early 1880s, a long grinding period of falling prices and tightening credit, and factories running short hours, and farmers watching the value of what they grew decline faster than the cost of the debt they owed. The panic of 1893 arrived in much the same way. With the failure of several large railroads and the rapid contraction of credit, and what followed it was the worst economic downturn the United States had yet experienced. Unemployment rose, wages fell, breadlines formed in the cities that had, a decade before, felt themselves to be at the center of an unstoppable expansion. The ticker tape that had brought fortunes in the good years brought ruin in the bad ones. The numbers falling on paper in lobbies that had been cheerful and now were quiet, with a different quality of quiet. The silence of men watching what they had believed in prove itself, once more, to be made of something thinner and less reliable than they had been willing to admit. The tape ran through it all. The universal stock ticker clattered in the hotel lobbies during the panics as steadily as it had during the booms, printing the prices faithfully, without editorial judgment, without reassurance, without any sense of the human cost of the numbers it was recording. A price was a price. The ticker did not know the difference between the kind that made you and the kind that unmade you. And yet there was something almost beautiful about it, in the abstract, in the way there is something beautiful about any mechanism so well suited to its function. The thin ribbon of paper unspooling, the small neat figures appearing in sequence, the continuous present tense of a price that was always now, always this moment, always the most recent thing the market knew about itself. It was a kind of truthfulness, however harsh. The ticker did not remember yesterday's prices or promise tomorrow's. It only knew what was happening, right now, and it said so in the plainest language available to it, number after number after number, without pause, until the close of trading, when it finally stopped and the lobby returned to an ordinary silence and the tape curled in long, loose coils on the floor beneath the machine like the shed skin of something that would resume its life in the morning. Let the ticker be still for a moment. Let the lobby empty and the tape go quiet, and the last printed number hang there in the air of the room, whatever it was, whatever it meant for whoever was watching it, good or ruinous, or somewhere in the long, uncertain middle where most numbers lived. You have climbed further tonight than you perhaps expected. 3 rungs now below the summit, past the general store and its running ledger, past the office of the new corporation and the visible hand of management, into the hotel lobby where the tape runs and the future arrives in the shape of printed numbers and sometimes takes everything you have in the space of an afternoon. The ladder still rises above you. The great trusts are there, and the men who built the railroads and the steel mills and the oil refineries, and at the very top, lit differently from any rung below, the world of the 400, where a ballroom holds everyone who matters, and the girl in the wedding veil is weeping behind the lace of something that was decided for her long before the day arrived. But the ticker is quiet now, and the lobby is empty, and the next rung can wait until the narration finds it again in its own time, unhurried, the way all the best discoveries wait for you, patiently, in the dark, knowing you will arrive eventually, because the thread is still there, the invisible thread running from the bottom of the ladder to the top. From the air shaft and the borrowed bed to the marble rooms above the harbour, and you are somewhere in the long middle of it, climbing slowly, at rest between one rung and the next. The next rung is not a person exactly. It is a shape that money takes when one person's hands are no longer enough to hold all of it, and a new kind of vessel has to be invented to contain it. The trust is that vessel. And if you want to understand how the gilding was made, you need to understand the trust the way a locksmith understands a lock, not the beauty of it from the outside, but the mechanism turning quietly within. By the early 1880s, John D. Rockefeller had already done something that had never quite been done before. He had looked at the oil business in all its chaotic, competing, wasteful sprawl, the 100 small refineries in Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and the river towns of Pennsylvania, and he had decided that chaos itself was the problem, and that the solution was to own the whole of it, not to compete, to absorb, one by one, quietly or loudly, as the occasion demanded. He had bought or broken the refineries around him until Standard Oil controlled not a portion of American oil refining, but very nearly all of it. Historians estimate the figure reached something close to 90%. 9 barrels in 10, running through pipes and cars and storage tanks that belonged to one company, answering to one man. But the law was a problem. State laws in that era generally prevented one company from owning the shares of another company incorporated in a different state. You could dominate your own state, you could not so easily reach across the border and own what was there. Rockefeller needed a solution, and he found one in his lawyer, a man named Samuel T. Dodd, who in 1882 drew up an arrangement that became the template for an age. The idea was simple in the way that very clever ideas sometimes are, once someone has had them. Stockholders of dozens of separate companies in different states would hand their shares, not sell them, hand them to a small board of trustees. The trustees would then run all these legally distinct companies as a single coordinated enterprise. The stockholders would receive trust certificates in return, entitling them to their share of the earnings. But the control, the decision-making, the power to set prices and crush rivals and negotiate with railroads, all of that would sit with the board. The trust, a word that had meant something like reliable care, now came to mean something closer to the opposite, at least for anyone outside its shelter. The Standard Oil Trust was not the first of its kind in spirit, but it was the first in formal legal structure, and it worked. And because it worked, the word trust became the general name for any great industrial combination that sought to corner a market: steel trusts, sugar trusts, tobacco trusts, the trusts in beef and copper and paper. The era that bore the Gilded name was also the era of the trust, and the two things were not unrelated. But the trust in 1882 was only the latest layer of something that had been building for a decade. Go back 10 years to 1872, and you find the mechanism in its earlier, rawer form, when it was still small enough to see all its working parts at once. That earlier mechanism was the South Improvement Company, a scheme so audacious that even by the standards of the age it caused something like genuine shock when its details became public. Here is what it did. Standard Oil, already powerful in Ohio, approached the great railroads that carried oil from the Pennsylvania fields to the refineries and from the refineries to the markets. It negotiated not merely a lower rate for itself, that alone would have been merely shrewd, but something harder to describe without pausing to let it settle in. Standard Oil arranged that its competitors, the independent refiners, would pay the railroads a higher rate whenever they shipped a barrel, and then, from that higher rate, the railroad would pay a portion back to Standard Oil, not to the independent refiner who had actually shipped the barrel. To Standard Oil, which had shipped nothing, but which had arranged to receive a piece of what its rivals paid for the privilege of staying in business. This payment was called a drawback. Every barrel its competitors shipped was, in a quiet sense, working for Standard Oil. The competitors were financing, through the act of competing, the very entity that was crushing them. The railroads, which depended on Standard Oil's enormous shipping volume, were glad to participate. The scheme was not illegal under the law of the time. It was simply a private arrangement between powerful parties who had the leverage to make it. When the details leaked, and in 1872 they did leak loudly into the Pennsylvania press and then beyond, there was a fury of sorts, the kind of fury that moves quickly and then finds it has nowhere to go because nothing in the law quite catches the thing that caused it. The South Improvement Company was dissolved under pressure. Standard Oil kept the refineries it had acquired with the advantage the scheme had provided. And the underlying arrangement, the preferential rate, the rebate, persisted in various forms for years. There was another instrument called the pool, which was simpler and older, and in some ways more fragile. A pool was what competing railroads formed when they agreed among themselves to stop competing. They would sit together, these men who were nominally rivals, and they would divide the traffic between them and agree on rates, so that no one of them would undercut the others and drive prices down to a level where none of them made money. The pool was an informal cartel, and its great weakness was that it required everyone to hold firm, and the temptation to cheat, to quietly offer a shipper a better rate and take more of the traffic for yourself, was always present. Pools formed and dissolved and reformed with the regularity of things that are held together by mutual interest and no enforcement. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which declared that combinations in restraint of trade were unlawful. It was a law that felt, when it passed, like a reckoning. And in practice, for its first decade, it was enforced so rarely and so selectively that it sometimes seemed to work harder against labor unions, whose collective bargaining could also be characterized as a combination in restraint of trade, than against the great industrial monopolies it had been named to address. The trusts, for their part, found a new shelter. New Jersey, in 1889, had passed a law allowing what was called a holding company, a single corporation that could legally own the shares of other corporations in other states. The legal weapon that Dodd had improvised in 1882 had now been given a permanent, clean, legislative home, and the trusts moved quietly into it and stayed. This is the rung where the money stops being about any single transaction. The barrel sold, the seam of coal worked, the shirt finished in a tenement kitchen, and becomes about the architecture of the system itself. The trust does not earn its money the way the factory hand earns his. It earns it by arranging the terms on which everyone below it must operate. And that is a different kind of power from anything we have visited on the lower rungs, a kind of power that looks, from a distance, less like work and more like weather. Above the trust, the air changes again. Cornelius Vanderbilt was called Commodore because he had made his first fortune in steamships, ferrying passengers and freight on the waters around New York in an era when the rivers were the highways and the man who controlled the boats controlled the movement of commerce. By the time the Civil War ended, he had decided that the future was not water, but iron rails. And he turned toward the railroads with the same instinct he had always had, not for innovation exactly, but for consolidation, for seeing that 10 competing lines were weaker than one coordinated network, and for having the nerve and the capital to make them one. The New York Central became the backbone of his empire, running from New York City north and west into the continent, carrying freight and passengers on a schedule that, for its time, was something close to reliable. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, his estate was estimated near $100 million. Historians are careful to say estimated. The true accounting of a fortune like that was not something the public was invited to audit. But the figure that circulated, and that has circulated ever since, is that he left behind more cash than the United States Treasury held at that moment. One man's death, and the counting took years. The railroads were also built on land. This is worth sitting with. The federal government, in the years after the Civil War, granted the great railroad companies tens of millions of acres of land along their routes, land that had been, in legal theory, public, and that now became private, belonging to the railroads, to be sold to settlers and speculators as the lines pushed west. The railroads were not merely transportation companies. They were the era's greatest landlords, holding more acreage than some European nations. And because they held the land and ran the only line through it, they could charge what they chose to the farmers who needed to reach market, and to the towns that needed to receive goods, and there was no one to go around them. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th, 1869, at a place called Promontory Summit in Utah, where a golden spike, a real one ceremonially placed, joined the tracks of the Union Pacific coming from the east and the Central Pacific coming from the west. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the century, and the ceremony that marked it was photographed and telegraphed and celebrated across the country as a symbol of what the nation had accomplished in the years since the war. Behind the ceremony was a scandal that would not fully surface for several years. The men who controlled the Union Pacific had created a construction company called Crédit Mobilier and had given it contracts to build the railroad at prices far above what the work actually cost. The difference, the inflation between the real cost and the build cost, went into the pockets of the insiders who controlled both the railroad and the construction company. To protect themselves from congressional scrutiny, they distributed shares of Crédit Mobilier to sympathetic members of Congress, including eventually the sitting vice president. When the story broke in 1872, it touched nearly every level of the federal government and left a stain on the celebration of the golden spike that could not quite be polished off. The railroad had been built with public money and public land grants. The profit, arranged quietly in advance, had gone elsewhere. Andrew Carnegie watched all of this from the position of a man who had started with very little and who, by a combination of relentless attention and exceptional timing, had turned very little into something that redefined the scale of American wealth. Carnegie's method was not the pool or the trust or the political connection, or not primarily those things. His method was the thing that economists later called vertical integration, and it means something simpler than it sounds. If you own a steel mill, you need iron ore to feed it. If you own the ore mine and the ships and the railroad cars that carry the ore, you do not pay any intermediate man's profit on any of those steps. You pay only what it costs you to run them, and you run them as efficiently as you can, because every fraction of a cent saved at each step is a fraction of a cent earned at the final step. Carnegie owned the ore. He owned the coke, the fuel that burned the ore into iron. He owned the ships on the Great Lakes and the railroads that connected one part of his operation to the next. He owned, finally, the most efficient steelworks in the world, at a scale no single competitor could match, at a cost no competitor could equal. By 1901, the question of what to do with all of this had attracted the attention of the one man whose capital could answer it, J.P. Morgan, the banker who had reorganized bankrupt railroads and who understood better than anyone the mathematics of industrial scale, approached Carnegie with a proposition. Morgan wanted to build the largest corporation the world had yet seen, a steel company that would absorb Carnegie's operation along with the operations of its major rivals and produce steel at a volume and efficiency that would simply end the era of competing small mills. Carnegie, who was 65 years old and had been thinking about what to do with the rest of his life, agreed to sell. The price was approximately $1.4 billion, a number that required a new word, the word billion, to be said aloud in the context of a business transaction. Carnegie himself took roughly $226 million in gold bonds. U.S. Steel, the corporation Morgan assembled from the pieces, was capitalized at about $1.4 billion. Making it the first billion-dollar corporation in history. When the newspapers reported it, some of them simply ran the number and then paused, as though the punctuation itself was asking the reader to verify they had read it correctly. John D. Rockefeller's wealth moved on a similar trajectory, though the accounting of it was even harder to pin down, and is to this day a matter of some scholarly range. What the record does appear to support is that sometime around 1916, Rockefeller became what we now call a billionaire, the first in the American record. The Standard Oil fortune had not simply survived the Sherman Antitrust Act. It had grown through the era of the trust into something so large that when the Supreme Court finally broke it apart in 1911, the pieces were individually worth more than the whole had been when the law first tried to contain it. These are the men of the second to last rung. You do not encounter them on the street. You encounter the things they have made: the price of coal, the fare on the railroad, the cost of the oil that lights the lamp in the room where you sleep, and behind each of those numbers, if you trace the thread far enough, you find one of these men. Or the man who owes his position to one of these men, or the arrangement that one of these men made with a railroad, or a legislator, or a judge. The money does not announce itself. It is simply the condition of things, the way the air pressure is a condition you live inside without noticing, and only know is there when it changes. Now comes the rung that complicates everything above it. Carnegie had a theory about what a man of great wealth owed the world, and he published it in 1889 in an essay called Simply Wealth, which later came to be known as the Gospel of Wealth. The argument was not modest. Carnegie believed, and he laid it out with the calm certainty of a man who had thought about almost nothing else for years, that the accumulation of great wealth in the hands of a few was not an accident or a scandal, but the natural result of the laws of competition, which were themselves the laws of civilization. The rich man was not lucky. He was capable, in a way that most people were not, of organizing capital and labor into efficient combinations, and this capacity deserved its reward. But the reward came with an obligation. Carnegie was direct about this. The man who accumulated great wealth and then left it to his children was doing a disservice to his children and to society both. The man who accumulated great wealth and died with it was worse. The man who dies thus rich, Carnegie wrote, dies disgraced. The fortune, accumulated through a lifetime of superior capacity, should be returned to society through the one act that only a rich man could perform at scale, the giving away of money to institutions that would outlast him and serve the public long after the man himself was gone. Carnegie began to build libraries. The number he eventually funded, worldwide, was something close to 2,500, of which roughly 1,700 were in the United States, in towns large and small, in places that had never had a public library and would not have had one for many more years without his intervention. You can still walk into them today, many of them, and find the same carved stonework and the same high windows, built to a standard that said, "This is a serious place, and the knowledge inside it is meant for anyone who walks through the door." It is not possible to sit inside one of those libraries without knowing also what happened at Homestead in 1892. Carnegie was in Scotland that summer, as he often was, managing his reputation as a man of enlightened labour relations while his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, managed the reality. Frick locked out the steelworkers, brought 300 Pinkerton agents up the Monongahela River on barges in the dark, and fought a day-long gun battle that left roughly 10 men dead on both sides before the state militia arrived to restore order on Frick's terms. The union was broken. The men who had worked Carnegie's furnaces went back, those who were taken back, at wages Carnegie and Frick had set without negotiation. Carnegie, from Scotland, expressed regret. He and Frick had exchanged letters in the months before that made clear he knew what was coming and had sanctioned it. The libraries kept being built. The workers at Homestead remained non-union for decades. This is not a contradiction to resolve. It is the thing itself. The same dollar that funded the library was earned in the same system that produced Homestead. The giving was real, the books were real, the buildings were real, the readers were real. The cost was also real, paid in shift lengths and broken unions, and the bodies on the riverbank. Carnegie seems to have understood that the giving was necessary, partly because the getting had been so hard. He was not pretending. He was settling an account that he knew needed settling in the only currency that was available to him. Rockefeller did something similar on a scale that, if anything, exceeded even Carnegie's. He founded the University of Chicago in 1890, giving it not merely a building or a fund, but the endowment and the institutional framework to become one of the great research universities in the world. He established the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, a philanthropic organization that directed money toward public health and education and scientific research at a scale that no government in that era was matching. The General Education Board, which he also funded, poured money into the improvement of schools across the American South at a time when those schools had almost nothing. All of this was happening while a journalist named Ida Tarbell was sitting in archives and reading the private records of the Standard Oil Trust, reconstructing, year by year and transaction by transaction, exactly how the empire had been built. Her history, published in serial form beginning in 1902 and collected in 1904 as the History of the Standard Oil Company. Named names and documented mechanisms, the drawback, the rebate, the South Improvement Company, the arrangement with the railroads, with a precision and a calm that made it harder to look away from than a polemic would have been. Tarbell was not shouting, she was accounting, and the account was damning. The reputational stakes of Rockefeller's giving were not incidental. He understood that the public memory of a man is shaped by what he is seen to do with his fortune, and that the fortune's origin, however thoroughly documented, can be softened by a philanthropy sufficiently large and sufficiently visible. Whether this calculation was cynical or sincere is a question that does not quite have an answer, because large acts of giving are rarely made from a single motive, and Rockefeller seems to have been a genuinely religious man who believed that his wealth was held in trust for God and must eventually be returned to the world in some form. The theology and the strategy were, in his case, pointing in the same direction. What is true is this: the University of Chicago stands. The Rockefeller Foundation has funded the work that wiped yellow fever from the Western Hemisphere, among other things. The Carnegie Libraries are still there in their hundreds. These are not nothing. They are things that outlasted the men who made them and that continue to do work in the world. And they were made from money that was made by methods that Ida Tarbell spent years meticulously describing, and that Fitch had described in the steel mills, and that Rees had described in the tenements, and that the breaker boys in the coalfields knew in their bones without needing anyone to describe it at all. The thread is still there. You can see it from here. It has never broken. And now the ladder reaches its final rung. And the air is very different up here, and the light falls differently, and the people who live on this rung have spent considerable effort to ensure that it stays that way. Ward McAllister was a man who understood that a society which had recently been made rich needed to be told who, among its newly rich members, actually mattered. This was not simply vanity, or not only vanity, it was a social function. The old families of New York, the ones whose money traced back to an era before the railroads and the steel mills, needed a way to distinguish themselves from the new fortunes that were arriving every year in quantities that dwarfed their own. McAllister provided the mechanism. He called it the 400. The number was not arbitrary. It referred, he said, to the number of people who could fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and Mrs. Astor's ballroom, by his reckoning, was the only ballroom in New York that truly mattered. In February of 1892, McAllister gave the list to the New York Times, which published it. 400 names. The social arithmetic of a civilization condensed into a single column of newsprint. Caroline Astor sat at the apex of this world with a calm authority that she had spent decades assembling. She was the Mrs. Astor, the definite article doing the work of a title. Her family's money was old enough, by American standards, to have acquired something like the weight of European aristocracy, and she wielded it with the particular confidence of someone who knows that the room will arrange itself around her without any effort on her part. The Vanderbilts presented a problem. Their money was newer. Commodore Vanderbilt had made it in the raw and visible business of steam and iron, and the family had not yet acquired the patina that old society required. Alva Vanderbilt, who had married into the family and who had opinions about this state of affairs, decided to force the issue in the only way available to her. She would throw a party so spectacular that Mrs. Astor would have no choice but to acknowledge it. The costume ball of March 26, 1883, cost approximately $250,000. This is an approximate figure. The society press of the era was not given to accounting precision, and the families had their own reasons for either inflating or deflating the number. But by any reasonable estimate, it was an extraordinary sum at a moment when a factory worker earned $1.25 for a day's labor. The guests came in elaborate historical costumes, as figures from the French court, as ancient Romans, as characters from Shakespeare and from mythology, and danced in rooms that had been transformed, temporarily, into something between a museum and a dream. Mrs. Astor had not yet called on Alva Vanderbilt. Calling, leaving your card at a person's home, was the formal acknowledgement of social equality, the gesture that opened the door to invitation. Without the call, there could be no invitation to the ball, and Alva had let it be known that without the invitation, the young women of society who were desperate to attend could not, because their mothers had not been recognized. The pressure, social and maternal and simply practical, was sufficient. Mrs. Astor called. The Vanderbilts were in. Newport, Rhode Island, became what these families called their summer residence, though residence was a word they applied to places that most people would have called palaces. The breakers, completed in 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had approximately 70 rooms. The Great Hall rose 45 feet. The dining room was designed in the style of a European grand palace and could seat the kind of dinner party that required footmen stationed behind each chair. The building sat at the edge of the Atlantic on a long green lawn, and on summer evenings the sound of the ocean would have moved through the windows along with the salt air, and the candles would have reflected from surfaces of polished marble and gilded plaster. And the world that existed 40 miles away in the tenements of New York would have been, from inside that room, simply inconceivable. Marble House, Alva Vanderbilt's own Newport cottage, had consumed roughly 500,000 cubic feet of marble in its construction, marble from American quarries and from European ones, brought by ship and installed by craftsmen who worked to specifications drawn from the palaces of Versailles. The comparison to European royalty was not incidental. These buildings were explicitly designed to say, we are not merely rich, we are, in the American fashion, something that answers to what Europeans mean by nobility. Which brings us to Consuelo. Consuelo Vanderbilt was Alva's daughter and by any account a young woman of intelligence and feeling who had, by the autumn of 1895, fallen in love with someone of whom her mother did not approve. Alva had other plans. The Duke of Marlborough, holder of one of England's most distinguished titles and owner of Blenheim Palace, was in need of money. The palace required maintenance that the ducal income could not supply. The Vanderbilts had money in quantities that could supply whatever Blenheim required for generations. The arrangement had its own logic. Consuelo wept, by the accounts that survive. She wept before the wedding, and she wept, it was later said, behind her veil during it. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895. The dowry was approximately $2.5 million in railroad stock, the same stock that had been squeezed from freight rates and rebate arrangements and the long days of men in the mills. That stock, translated through Vanderbilt's New York Central and through all the mechanisms of the Gilded Age, crossed the Atlantic and entered the accounts of an English dukedom in exchange for a title that Alva Vanderbilt's American money could not simply purchase, but that a daughter's marriage could obtain. This was called a dollar princess, the term the press used for the American heiresses who married into European nobility. The exchange was explicit and understood by everyone involved: American capital for Old World title, the checkbook for the coat of arms. There were many such marriages in these years. Consuelo's was perhaps the most visible and perhaps the most contested, though she lived a long life and eventually found something closer to happiness in it than the wedding day would have suggested possible. Delmonico's restaurant in New York was where the 400 dined when they wished to dine publicly in a fashion that confirmed their standing. The menu was French, the service was elaborate, and the prices were of a kind that functioned as a gentle wall, keeping out anyone who did not belong. The table at Delmonico's was its own form of social credential, legible to anyone who understood the codes of the world. On February 10, 1897, the Bradley Martin Ball took place at the Waldorf Hotel in New York. The hosts, the Bradley Martins, a family of considerable wealth, had decided to stage something that would recall the splendours of the court of Versailles, with guests costumed as historical figures and a ballroom decorated to suggest the ancient regime in its gilded height. The timing was unfortunate. The country was in the middle of a serious depression. The unemployed were numerous and visible. The newspapers, which had moved in the preceding years to a more combative style of journalism, covered the ball with a fervour that was not entirely admiring. The editorials were pointed. The public reaction was fierce enough that the Bradley Martins, unnerved by the scrutiny and by the sense that they had miscalculated something, left for Europe not long afterward and did not return. It was, in its way, a small marker. The Gilded Age was not ending in 1897. It would run a few more years, and the fortunes it had made were not going anywhere, but the public patience for the open display of excess had begun to shift. The ball at the Waldorf was among the last of the great spectacles of that particular kind. The kind where the gap between the world of the 400 and the world of everyone else was presented without apology as something simply to be admired. And now, perhaps, is the moment to answer the question that has been waiting since the beginning of this long, slow climb. Why gilded and not golden? Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner wrote a satirical novel in 1873 and called it The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The title was the whole argument. Golden would have meant the thing itself, the real substance, the genuine article, the value that runs all the way through. Gilded means something else. It means a thin layer of gold applied over something cheaper. Something that might be wood or lead or plain iron beneath the shine. It means the surface is not the substance. It means if you pressed hard enough or looked at the edges where the gold was wearing thin, you would find the base metal underneath. That was Twain's observation about the era, and it was made at the era's very beginning. Before the trusts were formalized, and before the Newport cottages were built, and before the ticker tape had printed out the fortunes and the ruins of a generation of speculators. He saw it early, that the shine was real, and the misery beneath it was also real, and the whole construction depended on your being far enough from the base metal not to notice it was there. You have climbed the whole ladder tonight. You began in the air shaft, 2 feet of foul dark between the buildings you slept in, and the wage of $1.25 for a day's work, and the smell of other people's lives moving through the narrow gap above your window. You moved through the 12-hour shift and the long turn that lasted 24, and the breaker boy's hands black from the coal. You found the starched white collar on its day off from the laundry, standing in for a prosperity that was mostly an idea, carefully maintained. You stood behind the counter of the general store, where everyone's debts were written in the same ledger in your hand. You sat in the office of the new corporation and discovered that a career was something that had just been invented, and that you were among the first people in history to have one. You watched the ticker tape run in the hotel lobby and felt the afternoon when everything changed in the space of printed numbers. You traced the drawback on a rival's barrel and understood how 90% of a market becomes one man's operation through arrangements so quiet they barely make a sound. You rode the rails that were also the land, and you watched the golden spike go in at Promontory Summit, and you learned what was built behind and beneath the celebration of the transcontinental line. You read the Gospel of Wealth in the same breath as the account of the men on the Monongahela River, and you sat with the fact that these things are not opposites but two faces of the same coin, one side worn bright by use and the other dark from everything that bought it. And you reached the ballroom at the top, where 400 names in a newspaper column are the whole of what matters, where a daughter's tears go behind a veil on a November afternoon, and $2.5 million in railroad stock crosses an ocean for a title, where a marble house uses 500,000 cubic feet of stone, and a cottage has 70 rooms, and the salt wind comes in off the Atlantic, and the candles reflect from gilded surfaces, and the world below is invisible, and the distance from the air shaft to this room is the whole distance of the age, measured not in miles, but in the price of a barrel of oil, and the length of a shift, and the weight of a piece-rate garment, finished by lamplight, and the back of a child's hand in the coal. If this night has brought you something of the vast, strange shape of that world, the way it connected, tier to tier, the way the same dollar moved up through the hands from the bottom to the top, leaving a little less of itself at each rung until it arrived here, shining, at the summit. Then something real has passed between the narration and the dark where you are resting. If you have found these slow journeys worth keeping, if they help the night come easier and the mind find somewhere gentle to rest, you might like this video, or subscribe, or leave a quiet thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is a next video waiting on the screen, you can simply let it play. The thread will keep moving. You do not need to follow it tonight. You do not need to hold any of it now. Let the names settle. Let the numbers go. Let the marble and the air shaft and the ticker tape and the long white collar and the coal on the back of a boy's hand drift down into the soft dark where history rests when the narration stops. Let your jaw unclench gently. Let your shoulders find the surface beneath them and stop holding. Let your breath find its own rhythm, slower and then slower still. The way water finds the level it was always looking for. The ladder stands in the dark somewhere. The thread is still there, running from the bottom to the top, from the borrowed bed to the marble rooms, stitched through the whole length of an age that was never golden, only gilded, and now, at last, you can let even that go. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.